Part 3 of Black Amazon of Mars by Leigh Brackett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Gregg, Margarite. Part 3 of Black Amazon of Mars by Leigh Brackett. Chapter 7. It was past noon. He had climbed high toward the saddle of the pass. Kushat lay small below him, and he could see now the pattern of the gorges, cut ages deep in the living rock that carried the spring torrents of the watershed around the mighty ledge on which the city was built. The pass itself was channeled, but only by its own snows and melting ice. It was too high for a watercourse. Nevertheless, Stark thought a man might find it hard to stay alive if he were caught there by the thaw. He had seen nothing of Balin. The gods knew how many hours' start he had. Stark imagined him scrambling wide-eyed over the rocks, driven by the same madness that had sent Thanos up into the castle to call down destruction on Ciara's head. The sun was brilliant, but without warmth. Stark shivered, and the icy wind blew strong. The cliffs hung over him, vast and sheer and crushing, and the narrow mouth of the pass was before him. He would go no farther. He would turn back now. But he did not. He began to walk forward, into the gates of death. The light was dim and strange at the bottom of that cleft. Little veils of mist crept and clung between the ice and the rock, thickened, became more dense as he went farther and farther into the pass. He could not see, and the wind spoke with many tongues, piping in the crevices of the cliffs. The steps of the Earthman slowed and faltered. He had known fear in his life before, but now he was carrying the burden of two men's terrors, Ban Cruach's and his own. He stopped, enveloped in the clinging mist. He tried to reason with himself that Ban Cruach's fears had died 1,000,000 years ago, that Otar had come this way and lived, and Balin had come also. But the thin veneer of civilization sloughed away and left him with the naked bones of truth. His nostrils twitched to the smell of evil, the subtle, unclean taint that only a beast, or one as close to it as he, can sense and know. Every nerve was a point of pain, raw with apprehension. An overpowering recognition of danger, hidden somewhere, mocking at him, made his very body change, draw in upon itself and flatten forward, so that when at last he went on again, he was more like a four-footed thing than a man walking upright. Infinitely wary, silent, moving surely over the ice and the tumbled rock, he followed Balin. He had ceased to think. He was going now on sheer instinct. The pass led on and on. It grew darker, and in the dim, uncanny twilight there were looming shapes that menaced him, and ghostly wings that brushed him, and a terrible stillness that was not broken by the eerie voices of the wind. Rock and mist and ice. Nothing that moved or lived. And yet the sense of danger deepened, and when he paused, the beating of his heart was like thunder in his ears. Once, far away, he thought he heard the echoes of a man's voice crying, but he had no sight of Balin. The pass began to drop, and the twilight deepened into a kind of sickly night. On and down, more slowly now, crouching, slinking, heavily oppressed, tempted to snarl at boulders and tear at wraiths of fog. He had no idea of the miles he had traveled, but the ice was thicker now, the cold intense. The rock walls broke off sharply. The mist thinned. The pallid darkness lifted to a clear twilight. He came to the end of the gates of death. Stark stopped. Ahead of him, almost blocking the end of the pass, something dark and high and massive loomed in the thinning mists. It was a great cairn, and upon it sat a figure, facing outward from the gates of death, as though it kept watch over whatever country lay beyond. The figure of a man in antique Martian armor. After a moment, Stark crept toward the cairn. He was still almost all savage, torn between fear and fascination. He was forced to scramble over the lower rocks of the cairn itself. Quite suddenly he felt a hard shock and a flashing sensation of warmth that was somehow inside his own flesh, and not in any tempering of the frozen air. He gave a startled leap forward and whirled, looking up into the face of the mailed figure with the confused idea that it had reached down and struck him. It had not moved, of course. And Stark knew, with no need of anyone to tell him, that he looked into the face of Ban Cruach. It was a face made for battles, and for ruling. The bony ridges harsh and strong, the hollows under them worn deep with years. Those eyes, dark shadows under the rusty helm, had dreamed high dreams, and neither age nor death had conquered them. And even in death, Ban Cruach was not unharmed. Clad as for battle in his ancient mail, he held upright between his hands a mighty sword. The pommel was a ball of crystal large as a man's fist, that held within it a spark of intense brilliance. The little blinding flame throbbed with its own force, and the sword blade blazed with a white, cruel radiance. Ban Cruach, dead but frozen to eternal changelessness by the bitter cold, sitting here upon his cairn for 1,000,000 years, and warding forever the inner gate of the gates of death, as his ancient city of Kushat warded the outer. Stark took 2 cautious steps closer to Ban Cruach, and felt again the shock and the flaring heat in his blood. He recoiled, satisfied. The strange force in the blazing sword made an invisible barrier across the mouth of the pass, protected Ban Cruach himself. A barrier of short waves, he thought, of the type used in deep therapy, having no heat in themselves, but increasing the heat in body cells by increasing their vibration. But these waves were stronger than any he had known before. A barrier, a wall of force, closing the inner end of the gates of death. A barrier that was not designed against man. Stark shivered. He turned from the somber, brooding form of Ban Cruach, and his eyes followed the gaze of the dead king out beyond the cairn. He looked across this forbidden land within the gates of death. At his back was the mountain barrier. Before him, a handful of miles to the north, the terminus of the polar cap rose like a cliff of bluish crystal soaring up to touch the early stars. Locked in between those 2 titanic walls was a great valley of ice. White and glimmering that valley was, and very still and very beautiful, the ice shaped gracefully into curving domes and hollows. And in the center of it stood a dark tower of stone, a cyclopedian bulk that Stark knew must go down an unguessable distance to its base on the bedrock. It was like the tower in which Camar had died. But this one was not a broken ruin. It loomed with alien arrogance, and within its bulk pallid lights flickered eerily, and it was crowned by a cloud of shimmering darkness. It was like the tower of his dread vision, the tower that he had seen not as Eric John Stark, but as Ban Cruach. Stark's gaze dropped slowly from the evil tower to the curving ice of the valley, and the fear within him grew beyond all bounds. He had seen that, too, in his vision. The glimmering ice, the domes and hollows of it. He had looked down through it at the city that lay beneath, and he had seen those who came and went in the buried streets. Stark hunkered down. For a long while he did not stir. He did not want to go out there. He did not want to go out from the grim, warning figure of Ban Cruach with his blazing sword into that silent valley. He was afraid. Afraid of what he might see if he went there and looked down through the ice. Afraid of the final dread fulfillment of his vision. But he had come after Balin, and Balin must be out there somewhere. He did not want to go, but he was himself, and he must. He went, going very softly, out toward the tower of stone, and there was no sound in all that land. The last of the twilight had faded. The ice gleamed faintly luminous under the stars, and there was light beneath it, a soft radiance that filled all the valley with the glow of a buried moon. Stark tried to keep his eyes upon the tower. He did not wish to look down at what lay under his stealthy feet. Inevitably, he looked. The temples and the palaces glittering in the ice, level upon level going down. Wells of soft light spanned with soaring bridges, slender spires rising. An endless variation of streets and crystal walls exquisitely patterned, above and below and overlapping, so that it was like looking down through 1,000 giant snowflakes, a metropolis of gossamer and frost, fragile and lovely as a dream, locked in the clear, pure vault of the ice. Stark saw the people of the city passing along the bright streets, their outlines blurred by the icy vault as things are half obscured by water. The creatures of vision, vaguely shining, infinitely evil. He shut his eyes and waited until the shock and the dizziness left him. Then he set his gaze resolutely on the tower and crept on, over the glassy sky that covered those buried streets. Silence. Even the wind was hushed. He had gone perhaps half the distance when the cry rang out. It burst upon the valley with a shocking violence. "Stark! Stark!" The ice rang with it. Curving ridges picked up his name and flung it back and forth with eerie crystal voices, and the echoes fled out whispering, "Stark! Stark!" until it seemed that the very mountains spoke. Stark whirled about. In the pallid gloom between the ice and the stars there was light enough to see the cairn behind him, and the dim figure atop it with the shining sword. Light enough to see Ciara and the dark knot of riders who had followed her through the gates of death. She cried his name again. "Come back! Come back!" The ice of the valley answered mockingly, "Come back! Come back!" And Stark was gripped with a terror that held him motionless. She should not have called him. She should not have made a sound in that deathly place. A man's hoarse scream rose above the flying echoes. The riders turned and fled suddenly, the squealing, hissing beasts crowding each other, floundering wildly on the rocks of the cairn, stampeding back into the pass. Ciara was left alone. Stark saw her fight the rearing beast she rode, and then flung herself out of the saddle and let it go. She came toward him, running, clad all in her black armor, the great axe swinging high. "Behind you, Stark! Oh, gods of Mars!" He turned. Then he saw them, coming out from the tower of stone. The pale, shining creatures that moved so swiftly across the ice, so fleet and swift that no man living could outrun them. He shouted to Ciara to turn back. He drew his sword, and over his shoulder he cursed her in a black fury because he could hear her mailed feet coming on behind him. The gliding creatures, sleek and slender, reed-like, bending, delicate as wraiths, their bodies shaped from northern rainbows of amethyst and rose. If they should touch Ciara, if their loathsome hands should touch her. Stark let out one raging cat-like scream and rushed them. The opalescent bodies slipped away beyond his reach. The creatures watched him. They had no faces, but they watched. They were eyeless, but not blind, earless, but not without hearing. The inquisitive tendrils that formed their sensory organs stirred and shifted like the petals of ungodly flowers, and the color of them was the white frost fire that dances on the snow. "Go back, Ciara!" But she would not go, and he knew that they would not have let her. She reached him, and they set their backs together. The Shining Ones ringed them around, many feet away across the ice, and watched the long sword and the great hungry axe, and there was something in the lithesome swaying of their bodies that suggested laughter. "You fool!" said Stark. "You bloody fool!" "And you?" answered Ciara. "Oh, yes, I know about Balin, that mad girl screaming in the palace. She told me. And you were seen from the wall, climbing to the gates of death. I tried to catch you." "Why?" She did not answer that. "They won't fight us, Stark. Do you think we could make it back to the cairn?" "No, but we can try." Guarding each other's backs, they began to walk toward Ban Cruach and the pass. If they could once reach the barrier, they would be safe. Stark knew now what Ban Cruach's wall of force was built against, and he began to guess the riddle of the gates of death. The shining ones glided with them, out of reach. They did not try to bar the way. They formed a circle around the man and woman, moving with them and around them at the same time, an endless weaving chain of many bodies shining with soft jewel tones of color. They drew closer and closer to the cairn, to the brooding figure of Ban Cruach and his sword. It crossed Stark's mind that the creatures were playing with him and Ciara, yet they had no weapons. Almost he began to hope. From the tower where the shimmering cloud of darkness clung came a black crescent of force that swept across the ice field like a sickle and gathered the two humans in it. Stark felt a shock of numbing cold that turned his nerves to ice. His sword dropped from his hand, and he heard Ciara's axe go down. His body was without strength, without feeling, dead. He fell, and the shining ones glided in toward him. Chapter 8. Twice before in his life Stark had come near to freezing. It had been like this, the numbness and the cold, and yet it seemed that the dark force had struck rather at his nerve centers than at his flesh. He could not see Ciara, who was behind him, but he heard the metallic clashing of her mail and one small whispered cry, and he knew that she had fallen too. The glowing creatures surrounded him. He saw their bodies bending over him, the frosty tendrils of their faces writhing as though in excitement or delight. Their hands touched him, little hands with 7 fingers, deft and frail. Even his numbed flesh felt the terrible cold of their touch, freezing as outer space. He yelled, or tried to, but they were not abashed. They lifted him and bore him toward the tower, a company of them, bearing his heavy weight upon their gleaming shoulders. He saw the tower loom high and higher still above him. The cloud of dark force that crowned it blotted out the stars. It became too huge and high to see at all, and then there was a low, flat arch of stone close above his face, and he was inside. Straight overhead, 100 feet, 200, he could not tell, was a globe of crystal fitted into the top of the tower as a jewel is held in a setting. The air around it was shadowed with the same eerie gloom that hovered outside, but less dense, so that Stark could see the smoldering purple spark that burned within the globe, sending out its dark vibrations. A globe of crystal with a heart of sullen flame. Stark remembered the sword of Ban Cruach and the white fire that burned at its hilt. 2 globes, the bright cord and the dark. The sword of Ban Cruach touched the blood with heat. The globe of the tower deadened the flesh with cold. It was the same force, but at opposite ends of the spectrum. Stark saw the cryptic controls of that glooming globe, a bank of them, on a wide stone ledge just inside the tower, close beside him. There were shining ones on that ledge tending those controls, and there were other strange and massive mechanisms there too. Flying spirals of ice climbed up inside the tower, spanning the great stone well with spidery bridges, joining icy galleries. In some of those galleries Stark vaguely glimpsed rigid, gleaming figures like statues of ice, but he could not see them clearly as he was carried on. He was being carried downward. He passed slits in the wall and knew that the pallid lights he had seen through them were the moving bodies of the creatures as they went up and down these high-flung icy bridges. He managed to turn his head to look down, and saw what was beneath him. The well of the tower plunged down a good 500 feet to bedrock, widening as it went. The web of ice bridges and the spiral ways went down as well as up, and the creatures that carried him were moving smoothly along a transparent ribbon of ice no more than a yard in width, suspended over that terrible drop. Stark was glad that he could not move just then. One instinctive start of horror would have thrown him and his bearers to the rock below, and would have carried Ciara with them. Down and down, gliding in utter silence along the descending spiral ribbon, the great glooming crystal grew remote above him. Ice was solid now in the slots of the walls. He wondered if they had brought Balin this way. There were other openings, wide arches like the one they had brought their captives through, And these gave Stark brief glimpses of broad avenues and unguessable buildings, shaped from the pellucid ice and flooded with the soft radiance that was like eerie moonlight. At length, on what Stark took to be the third level of the city, the creatures bore him through one of these archways into the streets beyond. Below him now was the translucent thickness of ice that formed the floor of this level, and the roof of the level beneath. He could see the blurred tops of delicate minarets, the clustering roofs that shone like chips of diamond. Above him was an ice roof. Elfin spires rose toward it, delicate as needles. Lacy battlements and little domes, buildings star-shaped, wheel-shaped, the fantastic, lovely shapes of snow crystals frosted over with a sparkling foam of light. The people of the city gathered along the way to watch, a living, shifting rainbow of amethyst and rose and green against the pure blue white, and there was no least whisper of sound anywhere. For some distance they went through a geometric maze of streets, and then there was a cathedral-like building, all arched and spired, standing in the center of a 12-pointed plaza. Here they turned and bore their captives in. Stark saw a vaulted roof, very slim and high, etched with a glittering tracery that might have been carving of an alien sort, delicate as the weavings of spiders. The feet of his bearers were silent on the icy paving. At the far end of the long vault sat 7 of the Shining Ones in high seats marvelously shaped from the ice. And before them, gray-faced, shuddering with cold, and not noticing it, drugged with a sick horror, stood Balin. He looked around once, and did not speak. Stark was set on his feet, with Ciara beside him. He saw her face, and it was terrible to see the fear in her eyes that had never shown fear before. He himself was learning why men went mad beyond the gates of death. Chill, dreadful fingers touched him expertly. A flash of pain drove down his spine, and he could stand again. The 7 who sat in the high seats were motionless, their bright tendrils stirring with infinite delicacy, as though they studied the 3 humans who stood before them. Stark thought he could feel a cold, soft fingering of his brain. It came to him that these creatures were probably telepaths. They lacked organs of speech, and yet they must have some efficient means of communications. Telepathy was not uncommon among the many races of the solar system, and Stark had had experiences with it before. He forced his mind to relax. The alien impulse was instantly stronger. He sent out his own questing thought, and felt it brush the edges of a consciousness so utterly foreign to his own that he knew he could never probe it, even had he had the skill. He learned one thing, that the shining faceless ones looked upon him with equal horror and loathing. They recoiled from the unnatural human features, and most of all, most strongly, they abhorred the warmth of human flesh. Even the infinitesimal amount of heat radiated by their half-frozen human bodies caused the ice folk discomfort. Stark marshaled his imperfect abilities and projected a mental question to the 7. "What do you want of us?" The answer came back, faint and imperfect, as though the gap between their alien minds was almost too great to bridge. And that answer was one word: freedom. Balin spoke suddenly. He voiced only a whisper, and yet the sound was shockingly loud in that crystal vault. "They have asked me already. Tell them no, Stark. Tell them no." He looked at Ciara, then a look of murderous hatred. "If you turn them loose upon Kushat, I will kill you with my own hands before I die." Stark spoke again, silently, to the 7. "I do not understand." Again the struggling, difficult thought. "We are the old race, the kings of the glacial ice. Once we held all the land beyond the mountains, outside the pass you call the Gates of Death." Stark had seen the ruins of the towers out on the moors. He knew how far their kingdom had extended. "We controlled the ice far outside the polar cap. Our towers blanketed the land with the dark force drawn from Mars itself, from the magnetic field of the planet. That radiation bars out heat from the sun, and even from the awful winds that blow warm from the south. So there was never any thaw. Our cities were many, and our race was great. Then came Ban Cruach from the south. He waged war against us. He learned the secret of the crystal globes, and learned how to reverse their force and use it against us. He, leading his army, destroyed our towers one by one and drove us back. Mars needed water. The outer ice was melted. Our lovely cities crumbled to nothing so that creatures like Ban Cruach might have water. And our people died. We retreated at last to this, our ancient polar citadel beyond the gates of death. Even here Ban Cruach followed. He destroyed even this tower once at the time of the thaw, but this city is founded in polar ice, and only the upper levels were harmed. Even Ban Cruach could not touch the heart of the eternal polar cap of Mars. When he saw that he could not destroy us utterly, he set himself in death to guard the gates of death with his blazing sword, that we might never again reclaim our ancient dominion. That is what we mean when we ask for freedom. We ask that you take away the sword of Ban Cruach so that we may once again go out through the gates of death. Stark cried out hoarsely, "No!" He knew the barren deserts of the south, the wastes of red dust, the dead sea bottoms, the terrible thirst of Mars, growing greater with every year of the million that had passed since Ban Cruach locked the gates of death. He knew the canals, the pitiful waterways that were all that stood between the people of Mars and extinction. He remembered the yearly release from death when the spring thaw brought the water rushing down from the north. He thought of these cold creatures going forth, building again their great towers of stone, sheathing half a world in ice that would never melt. He thought of the people of Jakara and Valkis and Barrakesh, of the countless cities of the south, watching for the flood that did not come, and falling at last to mingle their bodies with the blowing dust. He said again, "No, never." The distant thought voice of the seven spoke, and this time the question was addressed to Ciara. Stark saw her face. She did not know the Mars he knew, but she had memories of her own. The mountain valleys of Mekka, the moors, the snowy gorges. She looked at the shining ones in their high seats and said, "If I take that sword, it will be to use it against you as Ban Cruach did." Stark knew that the seven had understood the thought behind her words. He felt that they were amused. The secret of that sword was lost 1,000,000 years ago, the day Ban Cruach died. Neither you nor anyone now knows how to use it as he did. But the sword's radiations of warmth still lock us here. We cannot approach that sword, for its vibrations of heat slay us if we do. But you warm-bodied ones can approach it, and you will do so, and take it from its place. One of you will take it. They were very sure of that. We can see a little way into your evil minds. Much we do not understand, but the mind of the large man is full of the woman's image, and the mind of the woman's turns to him. Also there is a link between the large man and the small man, less strong, but strong enough. The thought voice of the seven finished. The large man will take away the sword for us because he must, to save the other two. Ciara turned to Stark. "They cannot force you, Stark. Don't let them. No matter what they do to me, don't let them." Balin stared at her with a certain wonder. "You would die to protect Kushat?" "Not Kushat alone, though its people too are human," she said, almost angrily. "There are my red wolves, a wild pack, but my own. And others." She looked at Balin. "What do you say? Your life against the Norlands?" Balin made an effort to lift his head as high as hers, and the red jewel flashed in his ear. He was a man crushed by the falling of his world, and terrified by what his mad passion had led him into, here beyond the gates of death. But he was not afraid to die. He said so, and even Ciara knew that he spoke the truth. But the seven were not dismayed. Stark knew that when their thought voice whispered in his mind. It is not death alone you humans have to fear, but the manner of your dying. You shall see that before you choose." Swiftly, silently, those of the ice folk who had borne the captives into the city came up from behind, where they had stood withdrawn and waiting. And one of them bore a crystal rod like a scepter, with a spark of ugly purple burning in the globe den. Stark leaped to put himself between them and Ciara. He struck out, raging, and because he was almost as quick as they, he caught one of the slim, luminous bodies between his hands. The utter coldness of that alien flesh burned his hands as frost will burn. Even so, he clung on, snarling, and saw the tendrils writhe and stiffen as though in pain. Then from the crystal rod a thread of darkness spun itself to touch his brain with silence, and the cold that lies between the worlds. He had no memory of being carried once more through the shimmering streets of that elfin, evil city back to the stupendous well of the tower, and up along the spiral path of ice that soared those dizzy hundreds of feet from bedrock to the glooming crystal globe. But when he again opened his eyes, he was lying on the wide stone ledge at ice level. Beside him was the arch that led outside. Close above his head was the control bank that he had seen before. Ciara and Balin were there also, on the ledge. They leaned stiffly against the stone wall beside the control bank, and facing them was a squat, round mechanism from which projected a sort of wheel of crystal rods. Their bodies were strangely rigid, but their eyes and minds were awake, terribly awake. Stark saw their eyes, and his heart turned within him. Ciara looked at him. She could not speak, but she had no need to. "No matter what they do to me." She had not feared the swordsman of Kushat. She had not feared her red wolves when he unmasked her in the square. She was afraid now. But she warned him, ordered him not to save her. "They cannot force you! Stark, don't let them!" And Balin, too, pleaded with him for Kushat. They were not alone on the ledge. The ice folk clustered there, and out upon the flying spiral pathway, on the narrow bridges and the spans of fragile ice, they stood in hundreds, watching, eyeless, faceless, their bodies drawn in rainbow lines across the dimness of the shaft. Stark's mind could hear the silent edges of their laughter. Secret, knowing laughter, full of evil, full of triumph. And Stark was filled with a corroding terror. He tried to move, to crawl toward Ciara, standing like a carven image in her black mail. He could not. Again her fierce, proud glance met his, and the silent laughter of the ice folk echoed in his mind, and he thought it very strange that in this moment, now, he should realize that there had never been another woman like her on all of the worlds of the sun. The fear she felt was not for herself. It was for him. Apart from the multitudes of the ice folk, the group of seven stood upon the ledge, and now their thought voice spoke to Stark, saying, "Look about you. Behold the men who have come before you through the gates of death." Stark raised his eyes to where their slender fingers pointed, and saw the icy galleries around the tower. Saw more clearly the icy statues in them that he had only glimpsed before. Men set like images in the galleries. Men whose bodies were sheathed in a glittering mail of ice, sealing them forever. Warriors, nobles, fanatics, and thieves. The wanderers of a million years who had dared to enter this forbidden valley and had remained forever. He saw their faces, their tortured eyes wide open, their features frozen in the agony of a slow and awful death. "They refused us," the seven whispered. "They would not take away the sword, and so they died, as this woman and this man will die, unless you choose to save them. We will show you, human, how they died." One of the ice folk bent and touched the squat, round mechanism that faced Balin and Ciara. Another shifted the pattern of control on the master bank. The wheel of crystal rods on that squat mechanism began to turn. The rods blurred, became a disk that spun faster and faster. High above, in the top of the tower, the great globe brooded, shrouded in its cloud of shimmering darkness. The disk became a whirling blur. The glooming shadow of the globe deepened, coalesced. It began to lengthen and descend, stretching itself down toward the spinning disk. The crystal rods of the mechanism drank the shadow in, and out of that spinning blur there came a subtle weaving of threads of darkness, a gossamer curtain winding around Ciara and Balin, so that their outlines grew ghostly and the pallor of their flesh was as the pallor of snow at night. And still Stark could not move. The veil of darkness began to sparkle faintly. Stark watched it, watched the chill motes brighten, watched the tracery of frost whiten over Ciara's mail, touch Balin's dark hair with silver. Frost. Bright, sparkling, beautiful, a halo of frost around their bodies, a dust of splintering diamond across their faces, an aureole of bright light to crown their heads. Frost. Flesh slowly hardening in marbly whiteness as the cold slowly increased, and yet their eyes still lived and saw and understood. The thought voice of the seven spoke again. You have only minutes now to decide. Their bodies cannot endure too much and live again. Behold their eyes and how they suffer. Only minutes, human. Take away the sword of Ban Cruach. Open for us the gates of death, and we will release these two alive. Stark felt again the flashing stab of pain along his nerves as one of the shining creatures moved behind him. Life and feeling came back into his limbs. He struggled to his feet. The hundreds of the ice folk on the bridges and galleries watched him in eager silence. He did not look at them. His eyes were on Ciara's, and now her eyes pleaded. Don't, Stark. Don't barter the life of the Norlands for me! The thought voice beat at Stark, cutting into his mind with cruel urgency. Hurry, human. They are already beginning to die. Take away the sword and let them live. Stark turned. He cried out in a voice that made the icy bridges tremble. I will take the sword! He staggered out then. Out through the archway across the ice, toward the distant cairn that blocked the gates of death. Chapter 9. Across the glowing ice of the valley, Stark went at a stumbling run that grew swifter and more sure as his cold-numbed body began to regain its functions. And behind him, pouring out of the tower to watch, came the Shining Ones. They followed after him, gliding lightly. He could sense their excitement, the cold, strange ecstasy of triumph. He knew that already they were thinking of the great towers of stone rising again above the Norlands, the crystal cities still and beautiful under the ice, all vestige of the ugly citadels of man gone and forgotten. The seven spoke once more a warning. If you turn toward us with the sword, the woman and the man will die, and you will die as well. For neither you nor any other can now use the sword as a weapon of offense. Stark ran on. He was thinking then only of Ciara, with the frost crystals gleaming on her marble flesh and her eyes full of mute torment. The cairn loomed up ahead, dark and high. It seemed to Stark that the brooding figure of Ban Cruach watched him coming with those shadowed eyes beneath the rusty helm. The great sword blazed between those dead, frozen hands. The ice folk had slowed their forward rush. They stopped and waited, well back from the cairn. Stark reached the edge of tumbled rock. He felt the first warm flare of the force waves in his body, and slowly the chill began to creep out from his bones. He climbed, scrambling upward over the rough stones of the cairn. Abruptly then, at Ban Cruach's feet, he slipped and fell. For a second it seemed that he could not move. His back was turned toward the ice folk. His body was bent forward, and shielded so his hands worked with feverish speed. From his cloak he tore a strip of cloth. From the iron boss he took the glittering lens, the talisman of Ban Cruach. Stark laid the lens against his brow and bound it on. The remembered shock, the flood and sweep of memories that were not his own, the mind of Ban Cruach thundering its warning, its hard-won knowledge of an ancient, epic war. He opened his own mind wide to receive those memories. Before he had fought against them, Now he knew that they were his one small chance in this swift gamble with death. Two things only of his own he kept firm in that staggering tide of another man's memories. Two names, Ciara and Balin. He rose up again, and now his face had a strange look, a curious duality. The features had not changed, but somehow the lines of the flesh had altered subtly, so that it was almost as though the old unconquerable king himself had risen again in battle. He mounted the last step or two and stood before Ban Cruach. A shudder ran through him, a sort of gathering and settling of the flesh, as though Stark's being had accepted the stranger within it. His eyes, cold and pale as the very ice that sheathed the valley, burned with a cruel light. He reached and took the sword out of the frozen hands of Ban Cruach. As though it were his own, he knew the secret of the metal rings that bound its hilt, below the ball of crystal. The savage throb of the invisible radiation beat in his quickening flesh. He was warm again, his blood running swiftly, his muscles sure and strong. He touched the rings and turned them. The fan-shaped aura of force that had closed the gates of death narrowed in, and as it narrowed, it leaped up from the blade of the sword in a tongue of pale fire, faintly shimmering, made visible now by the full focus of its strength. Stark felt the wave of horror bursting from the minds of the Ice Folk as they perceived what he had done, and he laughed. His bitter laughter rang harsh across the valley as he turned to face them, and he heard in his brain the shuddering, silent shriek that went up from all that gathered company. "Ban Cruach! Ban Cruach has returned!" They had touched his mind. They knew. He laughed again and swept the sword in a flashing arc, and watched the long, bright blade of force strike out more terrible than steel against the rainbow bodies of the Shining Ones. They fell, like flowers under a scythe they fell, and all across the ice the ones who were yet untouched turned about in their hundreds and fled back toward the tower. Stark came leaping down the cairn, the talisman of Ban Cruach bound upon his brow, the sword of Ban Cruach blazing in his hand. He swung that awful blade as he ran. The force beam that sprang from it cut through the press of creatures fleeing before him, hampered by their own numbers as they crowded back through the archway. He had only a few short seconds to do what he had to do. Rushing with great strides across the ice, spurning the withered bodies of the dead, and then, from the glooming darkness that hovered around the tower of stone, the black, cold beam struck down. Like a coiling whip it lashed him. The deadly numbness invaded the cells of his flesh, ached in the marrow of his bones. The bright force of the sword battled the chill invaders, and a corrosive agony tore at Stark's inner body where the antipathic radiations waged war. His steps faltered. He gave one hoarse cry of pain, and then his limbs failed and he went heavily to his knees. Instinct only made him cling to the sword. Waves of blinding anguish racked him. The coiling lash of darkness encircled him, and its touch was the abysmal cold of outer space, striking deep into his heart. "Hold the sword close. Hold it closer, like a shield. The pain is great, but I will not die unless I drop the sword." Ban Cruach the Mighty had fought this fight before. Stark raised the sword again, close against his body. The fierce pulse of its brightness drove back the cold. Not far, for the freezing touch was very strong, but far enough so that he could rise again and stagger on. The dark force of the tower writhed and licked about him. He could not escape it. He slashed it in a blind fury with the blazing sword, and where the forces met, a flicker of lightning leaped in the air, but it would not be beaten back. He screamed at it, a raging cat cry that was all Stark, all primitive fury at the necessity of pain. And he forced himself to run, to drag his tortured body faster across the ice. Because Ciara is dying, because the dark cold wants me to stop. The Ice Folk jammed and surged against the archway, in a panic hurry to take refuge far below in their many-leveled city. He raged at them, too. They were part of the cold, part of the pain. Because of them, Ciara and Balin were dying. He sent the blade of force lancing among them, his hatred rising full tide to join the hatred of Ban Cruach that lodged in his mind. Stab and cut and slash with the long, terrible beam of brightness. They fell and fell, the hideous shining folk, and Stark sent the light of Ban Cruach's weapon sweeping through the tower itself, through the openings that were like windows in the stone. Again and again, stabbing through those open slits as he ran. And suddenly the dark beam of force ceased to move. He tore out of it, and it did not follow him, remaining stationary as though fastened to the ice. The battle of forces left his flesh. The pain was gone. He sped on to the tower. He was close now. The withered bodies lay in heaps before the arch. The last of the ice folk had forced their way inside. Holding the sword level like a lance, Stark leaped in through the arch, into the tower. The shining ones were dead where the destroying warmth had touched them. The flying spiral ribbons of ice were swept clean of them, the arching bridges and the galleries of that upper part of the tower. They were dead along the ledge under the control bank. They were dead across the mechanism that spun the frosty doom around Ciara and Balin. The whirling disk still hummed. Below, in that stupendous well, the crowding ice folk made a seething pattern of color on the narrow ways. But Stark turned his back on them and ran along the ledge, and in him was the heavy knowledge that he had come too late. The frost had thickened around Ciara and Balin. It encrusted them like stiffened lace, and now their flesh was overlaid with a diamond shell of ice. Surely they could not live. He raised the sword to smite down at the whirling disk, to smash it, but there was no need. When the full force of that concentrated beam struck it, meeting the focus of shadow that it held, there was a violent flare of light and a shattering of crystal. The mechanism was silent. The glooming veil was gone from around the ice-shelled man and woman. Stark forgot the creatures in the shaft below. He turned the blazing sword full upon Ciara and Balin. It would not affect the thin covering of ice. If the woman and the man were dead, it would not affect their flesh any more than it had Ban Cruach's. But if they lived, if there was still a spark, a flicker beneath that frozen mail, the radiation would touch their blood with warmth, start again the pulse of life in their bodies. He waited, watching Ciara's face. It was still as marble and as white. Something, instinct or the warning mind of Ban Cruach that had learned 1,000,000 years ago to beware the creatures of the ice, made him glance behind him. Stealthy, swift and silent, up the winding ways they came. They had guessed that he had forgotten them in his anxiety. The sword was turned away from them now, and if they could take him from behind, stun him with the chill force of the scepter-like rods they carried. He slashed at them with the sword. He saw the flickering beam go down and down the shaft, saw the bodies fall like drops of rain, rebounding here and there from the flying spans and carrying the living with them. He thought of the many levels of the city. He thought of all the countless thousands that must inhabit them. He could hold them off in the shaft as long as he wished, if he had no other need for the sword. But he knew as soon as he turned his back they would be upon him again, and if he should once fall... He could not spare a moment, or a chance. He looked at Ciara, not knowing what to do, and it seemed to him that the sheathing frost had melted, just a little, around her face. Desperately he struck down again at the creatures in the shaft, and then the answer came to him. He dropped the sword. The squat, round mechanism was beside him, with its broken crystal wheel. He picked it up. It was heavy. It would have been heavy for 2 men to lift, but Stark was a driven man. Grunting, swaying with the effort, he lifted it and let it fall out and down. Like a thunderbolt it struck among those slender bridges, the spiderweb of icy strands that spanned the shaft. Stark watched it go and listened to the brittle snapping of the ice, the final crashing of 1,000,000 shards at the bottom far below. He smiled and turned again to Ciara, picking up the sword. It was hours later. Stark walked across the glowing ice of the valley toward the cairn. The sword of Ban Cruach hung at his side. He had taken the talisman and replaced it in the boss, and he was himself again. Ciara and Balin walked beside him. The color had come back into their faces, but faintly, and they were still weak enough to be glad of Stark's hands to steady them. At the foot of the cairn they stopped, and Stark mounted it alone. He looked for a long moment into the face of Ban Cruach. Then he took the sword and carefully turned the rings upon it so that the radiation spread out as it had before, to close the gates of death. Almost reverently he replaced the sword in Ban Cruach's hands. Then he turned and went down over the tumbled stones. The shimmering darkness brooded still over the distant tower. Underneath the ice, the elfin city still spread downward. The Shining Ones would rebuild their bridges in the shaft and go on as they had before, dreaming their cold dreams of ancient power. But they would not go out through the gates of death. Ban Cruach in his rusty mail was still lord of the pass, the warder of the Norlands. Stark said to the others, "Tell the story in Kushat. Tell it through the Norlands, the story of Ban Cruach and why he guards the gates of death. Men have forgotten, and they should not forget." They went out of the valley then, the two men and the woman. They did not speak again, and the way out through the pass seemed endless. Some of Ciara's chieftains met them at the mouth of the pass above Kushat. They had waited there, ashamed to return to the city without her, but not daring to go back into the pass again. They had seen the creatures of the valley, and they were still afraid. They gave mounts to the three. They themselves walked behind Ciara, and their heads were low with shame. They came into Kushat through the riven gate, and Stark went with Ciara to the king's city, where she made Balin follow too. "Your sister is there," she said. "I have had her cared for." The city was quiet, with the sullen apathy that follows after battle. The men of Mecca cheered Ciara in the streets. She rode proudly, but Stark saw that her face was gaunt and strained. He, too, was marked deep by what he had seen and done, beyond the gates of death. They went up into the castle. Thanis took Balin into her arms and wept. She had lost her first wild fury, and she could look at Ciara now with a restrained hatred that had a tinge almost of admiration. "You fought for Kushat," she said unwillingly, when she had heard the story. "For that at least I can thank you." She went to Stark then, and looked up at him. "Kushat and my brother's life." She kissed him, and there were tears on her lips, but she turned to Ciara with a bitter smile. "No one can hold him any more than the wind can be held. You will learn that." She went out then with Balin, and left Stark and Ciara alone in the chambers of the king. Ciara said, "The little one is very shrewd." She unbuckled the hauberk and let it fall, standing slim in her tunic of black leather, and walked to the tall windows that looked out upon the mountains. She leaned her head wearily against the stone. "An evil day, an evil deed, and now I have Kushat to govern, with no reward of power from beyond the gates of death. How man can be misled!" Stark poured wine from the flagon and brought it to her. She looked at him over the rim of the cup, with a certain wry amusement. "The little one is shrewd, and she is right. I don't know that I can be as wise as she. Will you stay with me, Stark, or will you go?" He did not answer at once, and she asked him, "What hunger drives you, Stark? It is not conquest as it was with me. What are you looking for that you cannot find?" He thought back across the years, back to the beginning, to the boy N'Chaka, who had once been happy with Old One and little Tika in the blaze and thunder and bitter frosts of a valley in the twilight belt of Mercury. He remembered how all that had ended, under the guns of the miners, the men who were his own kind. He shook his head. "I don't know. It doesn't matter." He took her between his two hands, feeling the strength and the splendor of her, and it was oddly difficult to find words. "I want to stay, Ciara. Now. This minute. I could promise that I would stay forever, but I know myself. You belong here. You will make Kushat your own. I don't. Some day I will go." Ciara nodded. "My neck also was not made for chains, and one country was too little to hold me. Very well, Stark. Let it be so." She smiled, and let the wine cup fall. End of Part 3 of Black Amazon of Mars by Leigh Brackett. End of Black Amazon of Mars by Leigh Brackett.